Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of the Jams and Tea podcast, where we spin the jams and spill the tea. And we're here, and we're back still. We didn't go anywhere.
Yeah,
We
we,
missed you.
we we're keeping the schedule. This is going to be a bit of a shorter episode just because we don't have as much to get through this week, and also because I am recording from a prison cell, as you can tell. So, yes, we're going to talk about a couple of albums today. Jake and I are going to talk about the new album from Nilufer Yanya. There's an umlaut in there, and I'm not even going to try and figure out how it works. So it's just we're going to pretend it doesn't exist, and she's Nilufer Yanya. For all we know, that could already be right. Great singer-songwriter artist. We reviewed her last album, Painless, in 2022, quite positively. It was an album that really kind of snuck up on me a little bit and then sort of stayed in my life longer than I was expecting it to. I found myself throughout that year putting that album on casually quite a bit, enjoying a lot of the songs on that record, a lot of the instrumental texture and variety on that album really, really sang, I thought. And she had a lot of personality as a singer and as a songwriter. So really excited for this new album, which is called My Method Actor. Um, and and the lead up to this as well, the singles that Nilufer released only grew my excitement as well. The first single was called Like I Say, I Run Away. I'm pretty sure we actually talked about that single briefly on an Now episode earlier this year. Really great song, like really propulsive song with this really kind of huge sounding guitar line and great sounding drums. And then she dropped the quasi title track Method Actor a few weeks later as well, and I liked that song quite a bit too. And then she's actually kind of really did that whole thing that some artists do where you release almost the whole album as singles before the album comes out. So we had Mutations and Call It Love came afterwards as well, and they were a bit more of a they went in a different direction than the first two singles, and yet they still really, really charmed me. So I was really excited to hear this album and see how things shaped up. Jake, I want to throw to you straight away. What were your kind of thoughts going into this, your feelings on Nilufer from that last album and your experience with this new one?
Yeah, well, Nilufer was one of those artists who Riley just kind of tossed at us for a review back when it came out, of just being like, "Hey, this thing's big. I know y'all don't know about it. Here you go." And I was like, "Fuck it, man. We're reviewing Ghost this week. Sure, whatever, dude."
Oh, right.
And
That was the same week we reviewed Impera by Ghost. I
Mhm.
completely
we
forgot
had
that.
we had Connor and Brett on the show, I believe, in that
That's
episode.
right. Yeah.
Um, and I
I was
remember
notably absent from the Ghost review.
Yeah, that feels like a actually maybe that was for the best.
we're getting to the point in the Jams and Tea timeline where we're starting to review follow-up albums to albums that other versions of this show contained lesser members without. So it's whatever.
Yeah, I only said that because I did you hate that album? I can't actually remember.
Me?
Yeah.
Oh
I
yeah.
don't.
Yeah, that's right. I didn't say that because, thank God Morgan wasn't there to fucking drag us down. I meant because we were quite positive about it, and I just have a distinct memory of you being less positive. That's why I said that, not because I was like, fucking Morgan's a cunt.
Fucking Morgan here to ruin our fun.
Just so that
Ah.
that didn't get
I love
misinterpreted.
I and I also love well you essentially just phrased that to me as I'm not glad that you weren't there because your opinion sucked and it would have been annoying. I'm glad you weren't there because your opinion sucked and it would have been annoying.
Deep down, I think what it really is that in that review that we did, I posed a lukewarm defense of the song 20s, and I just like I was grateful to have less shit thrown at me than I could have had otherwise for
Yeah, I
that
mean, just
take.
one of probably maybe the five worst songs of the 20s.
That was a real like that year, 2022, I had the Impera 20s defense. At least like I wasn't like Jake was on my side with liking the album at least, but I was in a special place with 20s. And then later that year, Muse Will of the People.
Yeah.
Really had it out for you, honestly.
That was like I've never been so glad that I like an album. I don't love it, but I've never been so glad that I like an album as I was for Will of the People because it was so funny that I liked that album. It was just so funny that I liked that album. Anyway, yes.
Oh,
So we reviewed
um,
Nilufer Yanya alongside Ghost, and I derailed that entirely. Back to you, Jake.
okay. Um, I remember Painless being a bit of not a mixed bag because I was very positive on the album and I still am. I went back and listened to Painless again just to sort of confirm where I stood with her before I followed it up with this next album. And yeah, it's an album that overridingly favors its positive qualities rather than its negative ones, but it is a bit shaggy and its best moments do kind of stand head and shoulders above some of its more middle of the road songs, but songs like Stabilize, Shameless, Midnight Sun, still fucking amazing. And I guess for what I wanted on My Method Actor was just something that leveled up all of the potential that I saw in the previous album. And honestly, I'm really happy to report that this is an ideal circumstance where an artist just kind of decides to fulfill all of the potential that you saw in them from an earlier release. Because My Method Actor is just a fucking wonderland of textures. Like, it was what we talked about with the last album, too, is that we were kind of marveling at the production and how I remember we were throwing around a lot of like In Rainbows comparisons to that album, which I would also throw to this one, to be fair, just in how rich and warm and textural the instrumentation often is. But there's so much more to appreciate here. Like Nilufer is also a fantastic writer, and I let me push that to the side for a moment because I do just want to compliment the album on how it sounds even further because there is simply no way to say it other than I think that every instrument on every song on this album sounds wildly different to how it sounds on another song. And it's that kind of variety that I kept coming to this album back for. And like the couple of times where I maybe played this once or twice the way through extra times at work, it never bothered me that I had to do that. I never hold that against an album just because that's not its fault. But I was never like, oh man, I gotta, keep listening as I'm doing my job or whatever. Because I got to appreciate the fact that not only is this a far more like consistent effort than Painless, it's a far more conceptually written one as well, just because this is in tandem with its rich, warm sound that invites the listener. It also invites it with some pretty emotionally available content within it, because I would overwhelmingly describe this as I guess, a breakup album, but that's not. I don't want to limit its content because she uses this avenue to explore a lot of different elements of self-perception, but that's kind of the tone of what we're going for here. And let me just say, when we get to like the first couple of songs on this are nothing to sneeze at. Again, like I say, I Run Away is still a great single that I really enjoy, and the opener Keep on Dancing and Binding are really great songs. But once this album gets to Mutations, dude, oh my God. Like, not even just on a quality level, but from like a place of emotional resonance. Let me just say this much. I'm not gonna get into any shit here or anything, so rest assured. But when I was sick and in the hospital earlier this year, a little bit, I just remember feeling like such ugly, unlovable dog shit and felt genuinely horrible because of the sickness that I was dealing with, lower than I've ever felt. And the only thing I could think of constantly was I would kill to have even a semblance of what I felt like before this, even though I was an anxiety riddled mess. Whatever that was before this, please God, take me back. And so much of the emotional content on this album has to do with feeling shackled and addled in a way that you feel like you have to turn to drugs, in a way that you have to feel like you turn to, I mean, any number of horrible, unhealthy coping mechanisms, to the point where you miss the previous state of being that you were in, even though it was deeply imperfect and like really, really harmful to you as a human being. Like the relationship that Nilufer will constantly sing about and the person that she will constantly sing about is like, obviously a tangled and wiry situation that she had to worm herself out of. But at the same time, it was also a situation where, like, I think I was reminded often of the most recent Indigo D'Souza album in terms of its writing and in terms of its thematics, and how it's a lot about just like learning to live with liberation, and how liberation is a complicated thing. It's not a one-dimensional thing that you can just sort of dig your way out of. And it's like, oh, this is a good thing. Like, oh, I did it. It's like, this is about the complications. This is an album about what you lose when trying to recover.
Yeah, it's a lot about performance as well, and how like at each stage of your life and each role that you have in your life is a kind of performance, and how it feels to, move from one performance to the other. There's this line in the song Ready for Sun, which says, "I can't find my shadow, we come as a pair." And that to me like encapsulates and highlights that idea of separating yourself from this role that you have to play, and then how the kind of disillusionment and strangeness that can come from that separation. But apart from the thematic stuff, because I definitely, the most resonant stuff for me in this record has been much more to do with its musicality. I want to highlight this is the third successive collaboration between Nilufer and Wilma Archer, who's like their closest sort of musical confidant. And the three records they've made together, Miss Universe, Painless, and now this, like I think show a continual evolution in their creative partnership, but also like a willingness to kind of take risks and go deeper and create like huger soundscapes. I went back, I've spent a lot of time listening to both of Nilufer's previous records in the last couple of weeks. Miss Universe, her debut, is like it's a bit rough around the edges, and it has this kind of conceptual framework based in these interludes that I think doesn't really work too well. But the songs themselves on that album are like utterly knockouts, like just really, really good. To me, these three records are very close in quality, very consistently, while just establishing a distinct musical identity. One of the things I liked so much about Painless was how each song kind of felt like a very distinct entity, and there were different genres that were kind of being mashed together on that album, and ways that I thought were really, really interesting. But I also felt like that album ran out of steam a little bit in the back half, in a way that this album just doesn't do. It definitely front loads some of the more, knock you out loud, intense material with those first two singles, but there's a richness to the way that the arrangements on some of the songs in the back half of this album really evolve. I'm thinking of things like the strings in the song Faith's Late, which is just like one of the most gorgeously rich songs that Nilufer's ever made, I think. The way that her voice often is the anchor for these songs and kind of pushes them. But there are certain songs on here where it feels like her voice takes a back seat after a certain point in time for these kind of arrangements to sort of just push the song into a different space, just sort of wandering around in something a little bit more contemplative. So even though the first two singles are really kind of like loud and in your face with that distorted guitar, I feel like this album in general is a little bit more contemplative than her previous two. And the thing that stops it from feeling meandering is like how acute she is as a lyricist, which you've already highlighted, but also how captivating the arrangements are and how well produced the record is. Shout out to Wilma Archer again. This thing is a masterclass in engineering for this kind of music. I just want to highlight the snare sounds and just the general drum and rhythm
Mm.
production in general, but just like this album has some of the best snare sounds I have heard on an album all year. They just have that exact right amount of crispness that isn't too crisp that it feels fried, and isn't too soft that it feels muted. The snares really, really hit on this thing. I've already mentioned the distorted guitars on some of these songs that just absolutely railroad you, but also at the same time don't overwhelm the song either. The fact that, on a song like Method Actor specifically, when the fact that she's able to sing alongside that incredibly loud distorted guitar and not have her voice completely overwhelmed, even though they're doing quite different things, and the contrast is kind of stark. It's a really impressive balance to pull off. Mutations, which you've already mentioned, I think is another absolute standout as well. I couldn't get past how much she sounded like Sarah McLachlan on the song to me. It's not even that she's super similar to Sarah McLachlan as a singer in general, but just this song, for some reason, she sounded a lot like Sarah McLachlan. And
Yeah.
for fuller context, I've been listening to a lot of Sarah McLachlan this year randomly. An artist that's I've always enjoyed, like, growing up. I heard her songs and albums a lot as a kid because my mum really likes her. But just when you get to a certain point in your, like, I guess in your late 20s, I suppose, Sarah McLachlan hits different. And just like
Look, mom rock hits different after 25.
yeah, general adult contemporary hits different. Like my mid 20s, it was like Tori Amos started hitting different, and now I'm in my late 20s and it's Sarah McLachlan. So call it what you will. Yeah, no, I don't know really complicated thoughts about the album beyond that. One standout I want to shout out is Call It Love, which to me is like one of the best
Mm.
examples of the musical balance that I've talked about. There's a lot of different elements in the song. There's a rhythmic focus, there's a vocal focus, and it's all just kind of melded really, really well together. Yeah, I think it's a wonderful album. It's a real treat for the ears. And I'm just pleased to see that Nilufer still has it. So yeah. Right, let's move into the crux of our conversation today, which is that we want to talk about this new album from FOXING. One of the things that caught my eye about this new album initially was that it was a self-titled album. And if you know a little bit about FOXING, you'll also know that this is their fifth album. They've been around for about a decade. And I'll get a little bit more into the FOXING backstory shortly. But I couldn't help but reflect when I found out initially that FOXING were releasing a self-titled album on this phenomenon, because it doesn't happen all that often. But I think that when it does, it gives you a chance to kind of it's such a statement that it automatically invites speculation on why that decision was made. And by that I mean the decision to self-title an album when it's not your first album, essentially. A lot of artists and bands do sort of start out their career self-titling their first album because it's sort of like an arrival statement, It's like, we're here, here's our first album, this is who we are, and this is what we sound like. So we self-title it. It's much less common to see that happen when you're a few albums deep into a career or even further. So I thought it might be cool before we get into this Foxing album to kind of shout out some of our favorite non-debut self-titled albums. Jake, I'll throw to you. What does it mean to you? Like, what kind of thoughts do you have when an artist sort of self-titles an album, like, and they're, many albums deep into their career? And what's an example or that you have that you feel like highlights that?
I think my first example here is an example of that of refinement. There are often times where bands or artists will release an album or even a few albums, and it takes them a little bit to find their footing, find their audience, find their confidence, whatever it is that they're looking for on their journey as an artist. Maybe they haven't quite fully found it yet, but that's what art is for, experimenting. And eventually they get to a point where they're comfortable in their sound, maybe comfortable with their audience that they've built up, and they are ready to crystallize themselves. They are ready to say, all right, it is time to meet the moment. I have done all of this stuff, but it's time for everything to really begin now. So it's not a first album, but it is an album that is still self-titled at the start of a career, just not the very beginning. And the example that I used for this is the example of one of my favorite bands. It's weird to call them a band. One of my favorite trios, I guess, and that being Clipping. They're and I know I'm technically cheating here because the Clipping self-titled doesn't have vowels in it, but that's part of the conceptual framework of what the album is that the lack of eyes in the name clipping for the self-titled clipping album in 2014 is that it does not, it's just CLPPNG. And the reason it is like this is because the storytelling on this album and the storytelling overridingly of clipping is not, or is like in first person. It is putting you in the perspective of the I that would be in the song. And then it's basically like using that as an avenue to relay the often body horror subtext of their earlier projects like Mid-City and push that to the forefront and really make you feel like you are in an industrial hip-hop horror movie with songs like Body and Blood.
I actually remember, this is so nerdy and stupid. I remember downloading Mid-City on DatPiff because of Anthony
Ooh,
Fantano, of all things,
yeah.
way back in the day. And it's crazy to see how far they've come since then. Morgan, what are your thoughts on this conversation, and what's your kind of first example you want to bring up?
First one I'll bring up is actually one I think I've mentioned on the show before a handful of times. This one I mentioned because it remains, even though they are technically back together, it remains their last album, uh, that being Yellow Card, their self-titled. And this is really the best time to self-title an album, I think, is when you know that this is your final statement, or at least
Mm-hmm.
intended as such. Um, this is one of my favorite albums ever. I think it's their best album. Uh, it finally sees them, a great band, generally speaking, at their highest songwriting potential, delivering on as much pathos as you could imagine from a band that's had a long run and been through a lot together, wanting to go out on their highest possible note. And it's so perfect to name it after the band in this instance, just because it is such an excellent summation of what they were that when they decided to call it quits and what they had been up until that point.
I think this is an example, a great example of the ideal maturation record. Because there's an often case where, occasionally bands will get really far into their career and they'll get a little bit washed and then they'll self-title an album. And then it's a little shaky. Those can go either way a bit. But like when I think of how to do it correctly, I think of the Yellow Card self-titled when it's like this is a band that you can tell it's an older and even like more world weary version of Yellow Card, but that only serves to inform and make their sound feel as like, immediate and as like well formed as it always has been.
Yeah, there can definitely be instances where it feels like I like your decision to kind of invert the prompt essentially by picking a final album as opposed to a debut album, because I don't think I could even think of any examples of those. I'm
This
sure I
is the
probably
only
would.
one I know of.
I'm sure I probably could eventually maybe come up with something. I guess the Mars Volta's most recent album is their last to date, but it's not really a final album.
In fact, the opposite, kind of.
Yeah. So yeah, when I was thinking about this, I was thinking about, okay, so a lot of the time, sometimes it can feel kind of arbitrary. Sometimes it can feel like it's a decision that's just purely meant to drum up interest or attention. Again, I think of Pearl Jam and I think of Liars in those instances. Those are both really good albums, but it also feels kind of arbitrary that they're just self-titled. Or I guess maybe you call the Pearl Jam one Avocado if you're,
Yeah, to such a degree
Yeah.
that
but
it's not even really mentioned as a self-titled record most of the
yeah.
time.
And I mean, we talked about Blink 182 in a record club last year as well. That's an example of this as well, where, it's meaningful, but also feels a little bit arbitrary at the same time. The other side of the coin is you can have albums and I think this is kind of the archetypical idea of a non-debut self-titled album, which is that it signifies a reinvention of sorts or a re-establishment or like some kind of significant change. And to me, the definitive example of this, and I apologize if I've stolen one that you guys have as well. I mean, we can all riff on it if you want, but to me, the definitive example of this is Fleetwood Mac.
Yeah.
The addition of Buckingham and Nix for the 10th album of this band is the definitive example of this for me. It's not even the first self-titled Fleetwood Mac album. I guess Peter Green's
Nope.
Fleetwood Mac counts as their true debut. But so yeah, to me, this is like the example of this. Because in a
Hmm.
lot of ways, it's also, in a lot of ways, I guess you could make the argument that this is a debut because the change that the band experienced with adding Buckingham and Nix was such a huge change that you could make the argument that the band became a different band. I don't know what you guys think about this though.
Well, I mean, there's inarguably Fleetwood Mac with Peter Green and Fleetwood Mac without him.
Yeah.
So that's the best way to put it for me. It may as well have been a new band, really. What's in a
The
name?
stylistic shift they go through is so massive. They go from that kind of UK classic rock, sort of birds inspired blues, and then shift to what we know as Fleetwood Mac. So it's like, has any instance in, like, is there any other Fleetwood Macs out there? Like, is this the only basis for comparison that we have for this?
Surely not. Oh, I feel like I thought of one, but then I might be forgetting it. I actually no, I can't think of another example like this. The thing that's funny about this to me as well is that the big change is that Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks joined the band, and like they're the two that are like not represented in the name Fleetwood Mac. So
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of almost like the decision to self-title it is like these two new members of the band have such a seismic presence, especially in terms of both songwriting and performance, that we kind of need to remind the audience that it's actually still, the McVies and McFleetwood, like we're here as well, I find that really, really funny. Like the change is like the one thing that's omitted in the choice to self-title the album, kind of. It's just that's kind of amusing to me. Um, but yeah, like I said, to me, this is the definitive example of this, that it feels like a lot of subsequent bands, when they have some kind of internal change, have sort of drawn from. And I almost feel like if Deftones hadn't already had a self-titled album in 2003, they would have done this after, God, what's his name? The bassist who passed away.
Ji Chang.
Chi Chang, thank you. I feel like they would have done this like with what Diamond Eyes turned out to be if they hadn't already self-titled an album. So, you can't, but you can have two self-titled albums in a row. I mean, you could be like Led Zeppelin or Scott Walker and have four in a row,
Mm-hmm.
or Run the Jewels for
Mi
that matter,
Mr. Gabriel.
or Peter Gabriel. Yeah, there's actually quite a few examples of this now that I'm thinking about it. But they don't count because, you've done the bit already.
I do have one that's sort of an example that we haven't had yet. It's an interesting instance, I guess, when a band, has their heyday and then goes away for a while and then comes back, say for 22 years, for instance. You
Yeah,
might want to do something that signals to your fan base, hey, we're still here, we're still kicking, and any doubts that you might have about us coming back, let's try and dispel them by self-titling our album that we come back with, like Slowdive did
boom.
in 2017. And I think this is interesting because it's so often the opposite. Like, I can think of so many instances where, like, a band that has been around for a while, or a band that hasn't been around for a while and has been absent for 20 years or something, they'll come back with a self-titled album really late into their career, and it's not their last album. What band am I thinking of that did this? Stone Temple Pilots, I think, did it. I think they have like three self-titled albums, but like
Yeah.
whatever. They all suck. Um, point being is that this is an instance of a self-titled album that did not suck, but it also does kind of make sense because it's not the slow dive that you knew before exactly, but it's a slow dive that achieves the same effect. Like, we're going for the feeling that Souvlaki gave you, we're just doing it in a different, bigger, sharper way with a sound that is a bit more modern, contemporary, updated, but is still undeniably of what they were before.
Yeah, I knew immediately you'd pick this, and I do think it's a really, really
Yeah.
good pick.
In terms of like my favorite self-titled albums, it's probably my second in a sort of similar fashion. Although again, this is sort of cheating the prompt a little bit. I want to shout out another band that had a moment and then disappeared off the face of the earth for 2 decades or close to anyway, and shout out the third American football LP, um, which, you know, they have 3 albums. They're all called American Football. So but it's not literally called American Football 3, so I'm getting away with this. I feel like they've kept and this is complete conjecture on my part, but I feel like they've kept the self-titled thing as their recurring motif for their full lengths because it serves as like to say like this is what American football like is like at this particular moment.
Yeah.
Um
I mean, for that
and
reason, I always feel like whenever I'm referring to them, I'm using including the year like as a part of the title, like American Football 1999, American Football 2016, American Football 2019. Like that's just a thing I do, but I think it speaks to what you're saying.
yeah,
Hmm.
because they're all fairly sonically different. They're all certainly fall within the realm of Midwest emo, but LP2 is so much cleaner and brighter than the first LP and so much more like sort of content, it feels like. And LP3 maybe takes it to the darkest place that the band has ever gone to in a number of places, both sonically and thematically. And it's just really interesting to see how that continues to evolve as they go along. Will we ever get an American football album that is not called American Football? I don't know. We'll see.
I certainly hope not. I think they've committed too hard at this point.
And it's
That's true.
I just have to Michael, where's the fourth album?
I'm just
Mr.
let him.
Kinsella, it's been 5 years, Michael.
Get in the stew. Get in the stew.
Well, they cooked a couple years ago with that song I can't remember the name of that's amazing and the
Yes,
Fade Into You cover.
yes.
So I was like, I know
Oh,
you're alive.
Yes, that song is amazing, and I also have forgotten what it's called, but it's like one of my favorite songs of theirs.
Something Symmetry.
Rare Symmetry, that's it.
Yeah.
yeah, there you
That's
go.
amazing. That song is amazing. I want to shout out a couple of like unconventional instances of this. The first is when Jimmy Eat World released the album Bleed American, it's very proximal to
Right.
9/11. The album, I think, actually, I can't remember whether it was initially released before or after 9/11. I mean, I was not cognizant at the time, but I do remember that the album had to eventually be re-released as a self-titled album. Which is really, really interesting example of that of a self-titling being kind of forced on a band at the height of their power as
Yeah.
well, which is a
What
real
other
shame
what other
because
band was affected like that by 9/11? There was some other band that had to like change a packaging, changes. It was the Strokes. I'm thinking of the Strokes because New York City
yes,
Cops wasn't on the vinyl release of Is This It, but it was on the UK vinyl release. That's right.
that's right. That is right, which is like a damn shame because that is one of the best songs on that album. And the
And
one
then they
they
replaced it
replaced it
with is easily the worst song on
was it
there.
When It Started, the song they replaced it with?
Yeah,
Yeah, that song is not
it's
great.
fine.
So
It's
yeah,
there.
I do think this is an interesting example of like history conspiring to force a band to self out of their album because that's of course the
Thanks,
whole
Bin
reason.
Laden. You ruined
It's
my
the
Strokes album.
That's the whole reason 9/11 happened, of course, was to make this happen. The other unconventional one I wanted to talk about is an artist I used to love very, very much, and I still love the albums I love by them very, very much, but they're so impossible to talk about now because they're so just utterly gone and cooked. But MIA had a gambit
Yeah.
where basically all her albums at least the first four anyway,
Yeah.
were all self-titled, but they're all like different names she has, like different parts of her name or nicknames that she
Maya.
has. Yeah. So the one I want to cite as an example here is her third album, Maya, which is like an amazing album, by the way. One of the most critically reviled and hated albums at the time of its release, but has since gone on to have been one of the most cognizant and ahead of its time albums ever. A really, really fascinating record. Like all her first four albums are all amazing to me. I love them all so dearly. They all sound completely different. They're ridiculous. She is a ridiculous artist. And she is never more ridiculous than she is on the third album, Maya. But it's not really a great example of this prompt though, because she just does the thing where, all her albums up to that point were self-titled in some way. My actual third choice is going to be probably my favorite non-debut self-titled album, although I didn't really, to be honest, give much thought to what my favorite would be. But it's probably the self-titled Paramore album. It's my favorite Paramore album. I love it dearly.
Great
Uh,
choice.
it is an example of reestablishing and reinventing themselves as well because they were a three-piece at that point in time. So that was a change in lineup that led to that as well. And also one of the things I love about this album as a self-titled album is the way that it kind of just throws a lot of things at the wall. It's not just a reestablishing of the band, but it's also like a pushing themselves forward musically in some really, really exciting ways. Like that to me is the most intense Paramore album in terms of like the power performances on it. They've evolved so clearly beyond their origins by that point. So yeah, that's my kind of ultimate pick, I suppose.
That's an interesting choice because it sort of parallels with another choice in that like I view that as Paramore's Tusk because Brand New Eyes is their rumors.
Sure, yeah, I
Yeah.
can see that.
I thought about mentioning the Paramore self-titled. I ultimately didn't go with it because it's probably my least favorite album of theirs. No, I think This Is Why is probably my least favorite album of theirs, or whatever that one's called, the one that has This Is Why on it.
It's called This
This
Is
Why?
is
Why.
why that one.
Okay,
It is called This Is Why.
okay, thank God. Um, the early onset looms closer every day.
I feel like the big example of this whole prompt that's looming over us that we haven't mentioned yet is Beyonce. We would not be
Oh,
able to have this
yeah.
conversation without mentioning Beyonce here.
That
Um,
I haven't heard that
that's
album.
interesting because it feels like less of a shift and more like that to me is her kicking off an era. Because like when I think of the Beyonce albums, I think of like the self-titled to now
mm.
being like all of those albums, and then the first half of her career, like they very clearly are in a pre-self-titled, post-self-titled place.
Yeah, well, it's very much the point where she became like a kind of conceptual albums artist, where
Yeah,
she started
yeah,
to like, and also not just how big and successful that album was, but the fact that she released it in the way that she did with a surprise release and also had a music video for every song that
yeah.
wasn't just a visualizer, because I know bands like to do that now, but an actual video for a distinct video for every song. The way that she released that was so momentous, and self-titling it the way that she did as well. It's like you know, to me it always feels like spiritually, that cliche of being like, say the thing, that's the tweet, where it's like you
Yeah.
just say the thing, the name of the thing, and that's enough for people to like have a reaction. And so you see Beyonce and the album cover just being that jet black with the pink font, Beyonce. It's like that's the tweet. That's the point has been made.
I
Um,
mean, it's genius branding.
yeah, it's really
And
effective.
to do it on like not only is this the point where Beyonce becomes really more of a conceptual albums artist, but I think it's also like self-titling that album in particular is kind of crazy just because that album's all over the place.
Yeah.
Like it has songs that have weird fucking structures. It has songs that take like that sound absolutely nothing like one another. Like it's kind of bold,
It
honestly.
has it has Jay-Z going, your breastises, my breakfasts.
They're not all winners on there.
Like, and I
A
think that's
similar
the
thing
kind
with
of
the Paramore self-titled, which I think both were 2013, right?
yeah, they were. That's a
Oh
good
yeah.
that's a
Oh
Um,
good point.
wow.
Yeah.
Got a
So
big year.
but
Beyonce maybe copying Paramore a little bit there. So
yeah, okay, we can
I'm
go with
I'm
that.
sure it was intentional. She's just like that fucking Haley Williams. God damn it.
yeah. But what
Yeah,
you're
but I mean,
saying,
there's part two on that album, and then
Yeah.
there's Ain't It Fun and Still Into You, which is like the complete.
Yeah.
This is the dichotomy.
Yeah. And that's kind of the thing with the Beyonce album as well that you were saying, Jake, is kind of like it's all over the place. And that's maybe part of the point of it being self-titled as well,
Hmm.
is saying this is all the shit I can do. Don't you dare forget who did it. Um, so that's kind of the point with that, I think. Any other examples you guys want to mention?
What was I thinking of that I didn't mention? It was Alice in Chains. Um,
Oh
Oh,
yeah, of course. Yeah.
which I
oh,
think
yeah,
that's
yeah.
their best album if you don't consider Jar of Flies to be an album, which it may as well be. But
Yeah.
that
The
is yeah,
that's truly the Twin Peaks was a movie conversation of its era.
yeah. Which I think might tie us in nicely to the Foxing self-titled review because those are similarly bleak and
Harrowing.
confrontational and noisy albums.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, well let's get into it then because that's a really good point. Foxing are I believe originally from Missouri,
Can
based.
Riley, can I start this segment with a bit of continuity?
Sure. Yeah.
Foxing are a band. One day, Foxing will not be a band.
That's right. That used to be their Twitter bio, didn't it? I don't know if it still is or
Mhm.
not.
You read that out at the very start of the Draw Down the Moon review, if I remember correctly.
That
And
definitely
I just
sounds like
remember being so amused by the pomp and circumstance of the tone of your voice that I had to continue.
that was definitely a time where I was trying to bring like, urgency to the all the reviews I was doing and bring
Hmm.
like this sense of like I was still feeling it out, how to review albums. And I was definitely 2021 was definitely my make everything into a big deal era. Um, which I still am a little bit like that, I suppose. But
Yeah,
yeah,
well, to be fair, I think that you wanting to make the last Foxing album a big deal was a concerted effort on your part because it kind of deserved to have people blow it up a little bit, considering where the band were.
yeah.
Where were they, Riley?
Well, hey, nice. Where I was coming from was that there was so much the whole narrative around Foxing at that point in time, and of course a lot of what was coming from interviews with the band as well, is how like fragile Foxing was as a band, like how difficult it was for them to make records, how you know basically everything that could have gone wrong for them and their career basically almost had gone wrong for them. They were a band who initially had success in 2012, 2013 as a part of that sort of Midwest emo revival period. As one of those bands like World is a Beautiful Place and I'm No Longer Afraid to Die, etc., who were kind of, started out making this very specific variant of emo music, this kind of, wistful, angsty, but also kind of slow, atmospheric, post-rocky, variant of Midwest emo. And they had a good level of success, even if they were still considered kind of like a B tier exemplar even at the time. But they had enough success to kind of establish themselves with that first album, The Albatross. And but the thing with Foxing is that they always sort of had aspirations to be more than just that template, to kind of be a more complex band, to kind of push themselves in interesting directions. And what happened was in 2015, their sophomore album, Dealer, was released. And this album still had some of the same Midwest emo framework, but there was a lot less kind of the sort of twinkling guitars and bog standard song structures, and it was a lot more leaning into the post rock side of things, atmospheric, slow, meandering, beautiful. To me, Dealer is like one of the most underappreciated albums of its time. Like I love that album so much, and it got paid dirt. I think actually critically it was received, fairly well if lukewarmly. The thing that actually tanked Foxing with that album,
Uh-huh.
hilariously, is Anthony Fantano of all things,
Yep.
who gave the album I think he gave it a 2 out of 10. It was an
Yeah,
absolute
made his worst of the year list that year and everything. I remember it too.
And forgive me if I'm rehashing a history that I already went through on the Drawdown the Moon review, but it is especially relevant here. So yeah, that album got absolutely paid dirt by Fantano, and I don't know if that was specifically the thing that was the real catalyst for their misfortune. I know a lot of fans didn't like Dietler because it strayed from that framework, that kind of, template that they had established, and a lot of people found that album really, really boring. And on some level, I get that. I don't agree. That album is beautiful to me. I adore it so much, as I've already said. But it definitely hobbled their momentum, and in a way they never really recovered from that. But also, by the same token, they became even more of an idiosyncratic band, even more of a unique, endearing band from that point onward. And with the three subsequent albums, including the one we're going to discuss today, they have resolutely refused to repeat themselves, and they have made some of the most, urgent and exciting music, in my opinion, that any band rooted in that emo revival scene at that period of time has gone on to make. Uh, this really, the apotheosis of this was 2018's Near My God, which is still one of my five favorite albums of that decade. To me, that album is astonishing. I remember listening to it the day it came out because I had listened to the singles, and it blew me away first listen. There are some albums that come to be favorites of yours that take a little bit of time to reach that point. Near My God was not one of those. Near My God blew me away the day it came out, and I was obsessed with that album for basically the whole, period of, um, late 2018 when it was released. And the thing about that album that was so amazing, if you haven't heard it, was what an utter, like, radical departure it was from both of the previous two records. What an exciting thing that was closer to art rock with these kind of, dancey grooves and massive sounding guitars and really kind of complicated rhythmic parts and varied vocal performances. And the whole thing just has this kind of whirlwind pace to it. It's a huge sort of emotionally wrought masterpiece that they poured their heart and soul into. And it didn't blow up in the way that it deserved to. A lot of people, it got a lot of positive, reviews, and there was a small contingent of people like myself who were really, really passionate about it, and made a lot of noise for it as well. And that at least was enough to sustain them further. With the support of their fans through Patreon, I believe they eventually came back with 2021's Draw Down the Moon, which I won't get too much into this because, again, we talked about this, we reviewed this in full. It had a massively, for the limited budget that Foxing were working with, they pulled as much as they could out of that budget to make this rollout as big and exciting as possible. Had lots of music videos, they had, lots of a press cycle essentially that was, full of interesting and memorable moments. And then the album ended up being this sprawling patchwork that sounded, again, nothing like the previous three albums. Every song, almost every song, was a different genre. It was a really, like, daring and strange album. It didn't land for everyone. Had mixed reactions on this very show. It's an album that I loved and defended ardently at the time, then sort of lost the spark a little bit for me, but then has sort of come all the way back around to me loving it again. So it's a really unique album. I really admire it. In some ways, it's a really bold push for mainstream success. There's some real, like, with the title track on that, for instance, there's some real, like, radio friendly stuff on that that's kind of disarming if you're a fan of that to that point. But there's also plenty of stuff on that album that is much less friendly and much more radical and daring. And so that album to me, I think, is like, I admire that album so much, and I love it too. But it's like I admire more than anything else the sheer effort and risk that went into that album. But it wasn't a success for them. If anything, that was critically their worst received album, generally speaking. There were no massive standout pans, although the 6.0 Pitchfork review got a lot of attention for the negative tone in that review. So, there was a lot of discourse around the time. So Foxing were yet again in the same position that they've been in essentially for almost a decade, where they're underdogs. They've been counted out. They're relegated as an interesting curio at the very least. A band that people think are interesting and daring and do cool things, but maybe they don't just end up. A lot of people just don't like the music, but they appreciate it at the very least. It's kind of a kiss of death thing. A lot of people seem to have with this band, where they will give them credit for the ways that they stand out, but the caveat will always be, however, I just don't really like the music for me. That's the thing I've seen a lot when people talk about this band. It's like, cool that they do this, not for me, chief. And it's, it creates this pit of this knot in my heart. We'd really see these takes over and over and over again because, like, it is for me. And I think that they do an amazing job at what they do, and that basically with every album since Dealer, they've knocked it out of the park. It's always been an interesting thing for me because the album that made them successful, The Albatross, their debut, kind of a poetically ironic title, actually, now that if you really think about it, because it is an albatross for them. But that album to me, I think, is their weakest album, their least interesting album to me, because it's the least like Foxing. Even though for a lot of people, when they think of Foxing, if they've heard that album, that's what Foxing are, and they don't really truck much with the stuff that they've done since. So, all of that said, the new album, the self-titled fifth Foxing album, more so than any Foxing album before, announces itself with style and demands your attention. This is, as has been alluded to, the noisiest, loudest, and most harrowing Foxing album yet. And they don't make happy records. I mean, obviously they're a Midwest emo band. There's a lot of anguish. Even an album like Draw Down the Moon, which is definitely their most upbeat album, there's still a lot of darkness in that album. This, however, it's rough. It's rough going. It explores some really, explores some really bleak emotional places, and it's presented in a way that is astonishingly noisy. This is also, it's worth noting as well, I think the first time they've self-produced an album. Nearer My God was produced by Chris Waller of Death Cab for Cutie, and then Draw Down the Moon, I'm pretty sure was co-produced with Andy Hull from Manchester Orchestra.
I
Um,
think you're right.
but this album is produced by the band's guitarist Eric Hudson, and it's so very much an internally made album. I've reminded a lot of Everything in that respect, actually, who've been self-producing a lot of their most recent records as well, and kind of burying inwards rather than relying on outsider collaborators. And the end product of that is that this is an album that doesn't have the same kind of engineering refinement and smoothness of those last two albums, but is deliberately built in such a way where lacking that refinement is an act of strength that this album has, because it builds into its identity and it enhances the feel, the impact, the resonance of these songs. It's a rough sounding album with rough sounding songs about rough feelings. And that barely scratches the surface of this thing. I've said enough to lead off with. Who wants to kind of leap in from here and talk about their feelings on the record?
I don't know what my expectations were for a new Foxing album. After Draw Down the Moon, I kind of relegated them in my head to a band that I just thought weren't going to be around much longer because every sign pointed to that. And I mean, again, the three of us, we are the Draw Down the Moon defense force. I still that was I identify with Ryley's journey with that a little bit, because that was an album where I was really enthusiastic about it to start, and then my enthusiasm waned a little bit, just a tiny bit, just because that was an album that I feel like I really wanted to love that album more than I ended up, even though I still really like it. Again, there's songs on that album like Beacons that I think are just like, oh God, like, not only do they hit me right in the feels, they're just like immaculately put together songs. So like, I knew that Foxing still had gas in the tank, but in the current climate, I don't know how long a band like Foxing can sustain themselves. So when I turned this on this week, I was like, I have no expectations for this. This is a Foxing album. I've heard one thing about it, and that's our friend Andres mentioned that it was noisy over Discord. That's all I contained about this album. I didn't listen to the singles, like whatever. I just turned it on. And you're greeted to the start with Secret History. Now, again, I don't know what I expected necessarily. What I did not expect was a track that oscillates between kind of the opulent sort of like grandeur, like there's those swelling horns and stuff that are very like, ah yes, this is very near my god, this is very Draw Down the Moon. I see this is Foxing, and you have that like lilting emo-y delivery, and then the song just tears itself apart, and these absolutely harrowing screams come out, and this becomes a complete fucking barn burner. Like Secret History is such a great opening track because it's, it stealthily tells you everything you need to know about the album, what it's going to be about, and the two modes it's going to operate them in. And so, like, you've got these refrains on here, like, again, like, sharpen those dead dreams. It's really hard not to impose the narrative of Foxing over a lot of the lyricism on here. And this is an album made by people who are very noticeably downtrodden. They are not letting that stop them from doing anything. Make no mistake, they're not reveling in shit. They're picking themselves and dusting themselves off and moving forward. They're just not fucking happy about it. The sharpen the dead dreams, pay them violently, write them quietly, Secret History. Not only is this like a great set of lyrics for Foxing, and just like I can tell what led them to feel this way. Like, if you're an artist, if you've ever created anything in your life, this song and so much content on this album is going to speak so strongly to you. And when we go from Secret History, a song that already touches on some very fraught topics and topics that I have a connection to, I guess, we hit Hell 99, which, all right, fuck it. I'm gonna be real with y'all. I don't know what my favorite song on this album is. I fucking adore this album. I don't know, because there are frankly too many options. But Hell 99, I think it was last night when I listened to this for the final time before recording this, where I was like, I have thought every lyric of this song individually this year. This is a thought I've had to myself when it's just this internal monologue. I mean, not quite the opening scream barrage of the fucking Cards on MTV, Biscuit NYE, fuck, 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 which I have screamed every chance I've gotten alone in my car.
This is
I see God.
this is the evil twin to Charlie XCX's 1999.
It's and you know what? It should be allowed to do so, because this song is just about being frustrated with the moment. Fucking the throw out all the joy and show me metrics for my failures. I'm a person who obsessively looks at the metrics on YouTube Studio. This shit burrows into my fucking consciousness, and it sucks. I live in modern times. Give me a modern sense of worth. The line that defines this album, the line that defines this entire year for me is, I live in modern times. Give me a modern sense of worth. I told myself there has to be a better quality of suffering. That
Yes.
the idea of enduring, of suffering, of just enduring this onslaught of modernity, just to be able to do what you do, to make what you make, to sustain yourself. It is a never-ending journey that we are all finding ourselves under, and we all don't know how to cope with. And this is just a primal rage scream, but not just a primal rage scream. Hell 99, make no mistake, it's not a one-dimensional song, because it slows down at the very end. This song perfectly mirrors what it's like to have a manic breakdown, because you go up, you swell, you're angry, you're loud, your emotions are big, and then you come back down. You're out of energy, it's done, you're weary, you want to go to bed. And so you just let it out of you. And that's again, perfect time for Spit to come in. And I'm not going it through like the whole album or anything. I'm just telling that like this album's sequencing was weird for me because it oscillates between different energies, different tempos all the time, and does admittedly save a lot of its harder edged moments for the front half rather than the back half. And I think a lot of that dichotomy threw me off the first couple listens I had with this. But the more I listened to it and the more I got into the conceptual framework of every song, the more I started treating this like I treat Nearer My God, which is a song that, or which is an album that's less an album of songs and more like, again, that's an album where every song really does kind of feel like it's its own world, its own story. It feels like an anthology, where it feels like they don't necessarily go together, but they inform a greater thesis. This is the same thing. It's not as neatly put together. It's messy, it's noisy, it's angry, and it has some weird neo psychedelic bents. And there's so many surprises on here. And frankly, I love it. I love all of it. It's a difficult thing to get into just because again, it does go back and forth a lot. But if you are willing to interrogate each song on its own terms, I really think that there's something very, very special to behold here. And I can understand why that this album seems to be catching on with people in a way that I've never, or well, I've only really been around for two Foxing albums, but I haven't seen a Foxing album catch on with the online crowd quite as strongly as this does. And I think that that is partially due to its pivot, but also because I think the writing here really is not a step up from Draw Down the Moon, but it is just kind of a refinement of what Foxing is right now.
Yeah, well, the thing with Draw Down the Moon is that that album had a lot of love songs on it. That album was a lot about like kind of projecting a strong front and trying to kind of not let your fears and anxieties sort of become your whole identity. And this album essentially is basically what happens when that whole facade comes crashing down. You can't keep it up anymore. You can't lie to yourself and you can't pretend that projecting a positive, viewpoint on all these things is going to resolve how you feel deep down. This is just a complete, yeah, it's a break. It's a mental break. It's documenting and rendering through art the experience of, basically feeling your soul rend itself inside out. I mean, Hell 99 is such a like perfect encapsulation of that. It's a complete psychotic episode. These first two songs just being back to back is really, really important, I think, because they're kind of together the thesis statement for the whole thing. Secret History, which is an amazing opener, I completely agree. That really lays out the thesis of the record, which is that, it's there's only so long that you can have this dream that you're chasing, this artistic, you know, uh, goal that you're looking to reach, this thing that you've made your whole identity, in this instance, being in this band and making this music, while you have to kind of go through slave through a shitty day job and somehow try to have the energy for that passion afterwards. There's only so long you can sustain that before it completely turns you inside out. And then Hell 99, if, when you confront that, the reality of that, then you have a complete break where the mundanity of your life, the meaningless of all that shit that you have to kind of go through day to day just completely tears you apart. And then from there, it's like, I think a big thing about this album is like the search for catharsis through artistic expression, like the search for some kind of
Yes.
release. And the thing about the album that makes it complicated is that it's not as simple as screaming your lungs out and getting that release. You can still do that and feel hollow after it all. So, in a lot of ways, it's kind of a really hopeless album. I do think it ends, and we'll get to this. I do think it ends in a positive place. Like there's light at the end of this tunnel. But it is a really dark tunnel. And the light at the end of the tunnel is maybe not even a product of resolving the darkness, but finding distractions from it. So
I think a moment of darkness that comes relatively early on that struck me as one of the most like this is one of the most quintessentially foxing written songs I think I've ever heard, and that's Cleaning. Which is, a more low-key song. It's not really a song that leaps out and grabs your attention by any means, comparatively speaking. But Cleaning is just a song where, he's just kind of softly intoning that he doesn't want his room to be cleaned or the space in which he lived to be cleaned after he's dead, because that means that the people around him are moving on. They're cleaning up, and framing it like this, where it's like you're working through this problem kind of backwards, is so foxing to me. Like, it's very near my God. It's very like attacking a problem in the most like, haphazard sort of tangential way that you possibly could, but still rings emotionally true in that respect. And there's lots of like moments like Cleaning on this album where it's less focused on being like a complete song and is more just like, here's sort of a more tangential musical idea that's still going to inform the greater whole. But like, I got more and more out of these moments the more I listened to the album.
What's beautiful about that is I actually have a quite different interpretation of Cleaning than you.
Mm.
And I do think the song is written in a way that kind of offers that. But I don't want to get too carried away because Morgan, we haven't heard from you yet. What was your expectation, feeling going into this album? And set the scene and get into this however you want to. Like, let us know how you're feeling.
I didn't even know that this album was coming out until I saw that it was out. Like on the, I think I looked at Sputnik Music one day when it was one of the top four reviews on there, and I was like, oh, good, they're still around. Other than that, I was like, well, that's an album cover. I wonder what this is gonna be like. Um,
He's so real.
and then I just one of those moments where I was doing something else, and then I had one headphone in, and then I started Secret History, and I got through maybe 30 seconds of it, and I was like, I'm gonna wait. I gotta wait until I'm not doing something,
Hmm.
and just sort of sit there and soak in this. And that was before the song happened, really. Um,
Before the song became Deaf Heaven.
yes, fucking sunbathing. Um, and when the song did happen, uh, uh,
I
it's,
pooped my
it's,
pants.
I mean, it's what is has a song ever effectively replicated getting hit by a bus before? I don't know. This is probably it though.
My favorite thing about it is the way that it has that explosion moment and then it pulls back from it like almost like it
Hmm.
was like, oh, that wasn't meant to happen, I'm sorry, I let it slip. And but then it happens again, and the second time the song explodes, it does this mogwai thing where like it will wait a few extra beats for that explosion, like then you like, there's a moment where you can telegraph it, but then the song waits an extra couple of seconds and then it's like it's deliberately trying to scare you the second time.
Yeah,
Um,
it's literally like after the first time it happens, it's like, look, anyway, you
yeah,
know.
it's so that feeling of like how disarming that explosion of the song is like communicated so well, like through the way it happens. Um, and again, like we've been saying, this song is like a microcosm for this experience that we've been talking about that this album gets into, which is like, you've tried to keep this facade up for so long that things are fine, I'm fine, I can do this. And there's only so long before the veil comes down and you just completely fall apart. And the album, with that first song, musically and lyrically communicates that and sets you up for an hour long roller coaster.
Yeah, I mean, there's that song, there's Hell 99, which has already been we have elucidated on Hell 99. There's Spit, which is its own immensely off-putting
The first
thing.
time I heard Spit,
Upsetting.
I was like, this is evil Red Hot Chili Peppers.
Fuck.
Yeah. Um,
Yeah.
and then Greyhound hits, which was
Oh my
apparently
That was the first single, yeah.
bold.
dog.
They had this the way they did it as well was like they had this fake press conference like a politician would or something, and they invited like all these music critics. They invited Anthony Fantana actually. They had like all these seats at this like fake press conference they staged with all the names of all these like people they'd invited, not just critics. It wasn't just a critic target thing, but just like all these people they invited. And then they just like they staged this press conference to release the song. It was absolutely fucking ridiculous. Um,
That's amazing.
yeah.
That song hits, and it sounds like if Slow Dive was evil. Um,
A lot of evilness coming
and
up in our
yeah,
descriptions so far.
yeah, it's like it's absolutely stunning instrumentally, but it sounds wrong. And then the first line hits. I've been feeling like I can't come up for air for these last 10 years. What's wrong with me? What's wrong with us? And then I'm like, oh, so that's what this is. And I sort of had a moment where, you know, 2023 and 2024 have been difficult in a variety of places for a variety of reasons. And for the last, I don't know, 3 months, I've sort of had the mindset of everything will be fine because it can't not be fine. And if I spend all of my time thinking about what it's like if it's not fine right now, then I'm just experiencing what it's like to be not fine twice.
Mhm.
And but that is an active mask that you're
Yeah.
putting up. A mask.
Greyhound is such a interesting song for a number of reasons for me. To me, this song is such a powerful communication of being depressed in a lot of ways, realizing it late, going through all of your experiences,
God.
feeling like you are a passenger to them, like you are, to the side of everything that's happening to you. There's one line where he says, I feel like I'm in a dream being described by a friend, which really like that really stood out to me. That was a really, I thought, quite powerful way of communicating a particular kind of dissociation. Um, and everything kind of coming back to this refrain of it all meant nothing to me, like realizing how little any of the achievements you've had up until this point mean to you when you're in this depressed state. Like you're in a state where you can't appreciate or value the true, like meaningful, effect of the good things that have happened in your life because they seem to be meaningless in that state. They seem to have, well, I'm here at this point, so they can't have meant much, It's that mindset that really, I'm sure we can all relate. It's a really powerfully poisonous mindset, and it's a really easy one to fall into. And the song really captures it so beautifully. This is the thing about the album as well, is that, there's lots of conversations to be had about the artistic interpretation versus just writing about your life. And, it's a really important conversation to have. We should never assume that when artists write songs in the first person that they're writing about themselves necessarily. But this is an album where it's like, in so many ways, it just feels like such a direct and very meta album about what it is like to be the songwriter in this band, Connor Murphy, and being in Foxing and chasing this dream. There are loads of allusions to previous songs. I mean, Greyhound, the song title Greyhound is in itself kind of an allusion to the first song on their first album, which is called Bloodhound. This song structurally mirrors the song Five Cups off of Near My God quite a lot. Same kind of
Yes.
structure, same position in the album, and similar references to driving and water as well. That's one of my favorite Foxing songs, so I picked up on that immediately. Um, they have this tendency you've already kind of mentioned with Hell 99, Jake, where the songs will kind of start in a really loud and fast place and have this kind of like come down section in the back half. They've done that quite a bit in different albums, but they do it quite a bit here as well. Sometimes they'll invert it and a song will have a slow come down before an accelerated part, like one of my favorite songs, Looks Like Nothing. They have this sense of a massive break, a psychotic break colliding with, a dissociative episode colliding with a psychotic break, and they capture that a lot on this album.
Yeah, I mean, sort of going back to what I was saying a little bit about the masking over your own anxieties and your own depressive episodes, is that when I realized what this album was and when I saw it through to its conclusion, especially, um, I had a moment of like, okay, this is apparently something I needed in the sense that, you know, this did not spiral me down a path away from the relatively good past 3 months that I've had. Um, it did not cause, another episode or anything like that, or even really inspire much thoughts like that on an emotional, physical level. What it did do is it let me escape into that mindset for an hour at a time, where it is finally like a place where I can let the mask down a little bit, where I could almost like have a conversation with someone who understands it exactly, to
Mm.
be in a particular emotional place. And then when the album's done, I can close the window back up and carry on with my life.
Mm.
And part of what gives it that quality, as opposed to something like Nick Cave's Skeleton Tree, which I also thought of a lot listening to this album, is that it's not all it is all endlessly bleak, pretty much, but it's much more focused on catharsis and bursts of letting a feeling out instead of just wallowing in it and living in it and learning to understand it. And I think that's it's imperative to have both. Um, this is the first album I've heard in a long while that really gets at those moments of catharsis and how much that can actually mean in terms of being able to continue with your day to day.
Mm. There's a thing that we talk about when I was in a different life years ago. I was training to be a counselor, and there's a thing that we'd often talk about quite a lot, which is that there's a perception, a cultural perception that bringing up the idea of having suicidal thoughts or of being depressed or all this kind of stuff that's seen as taboo, like just bringing it up would be enough to inspire those thoughts in someone who might not have already been having them. And it's this weird like misconception that existed in culture that somehow making someone aware of something bad as a possible like thought they could have or thing they could do would somehow make them want to do it. And it's like, no, and actually bringing those things up allows a conversation to happen that makes them less scary to talk about. You know what I mean? So this idea
It
that,
becomes a thing that other people can feel and
yeah,
have felt instead of just something that is so completely like you have horse blinders on
yeah.
when you're
So
experiencing it.
like the idea that we should be, weary of like listening to albums that deal with these kinds of things or like having them around is like a thing we should be afraid of because it's going to like send us to a really, really dark place we can't come back from, I think is kind of a big misconception. Like, yeah, sure, different people, work in different ways. And for some people, it might not be a good idea to listen to certain albums or read certain books or watch certain movies in certain headspaces. But more than anything else, it's a good thing to have these things, and they can be really, really useful as resources and as ways of like recognizing and making less foreign and scary these feelings. Um, and the album does that beautifully. The album does that consistently, and in a way that's so confronting and so uh, Connor can be poetic in the way that he writes, but I think a lot of the time there's a directness to his writing in this. Again, that's what I mean when I talk about like the difference between like an artistic interpretation versus just diary style writing. This leans a lot more to the latter thing than to like, dressing up. He has very beautiful ways of communicating these feelings, like metaphors and ways of capturing it through words, some of which I've already mentioned, but a lot of the time this is very much just like blunt writing. I'm feeling this way, I'm having this experience, and it sucks. And I feel dead inside. and and that is like reflected in the rawness and in the utter lack of poetics in the instrumentation as well. It's just very in your face and it's very blunt and it's very direct.
Yeah, I mean, there's an interesting dichotomy to the album in that sense, is that a lot of it is that, but a lot of it is like things that you see on the song Barking, which is like kissing yourself to prime the rain. I can hear the clouds yelling back. I can feel the water in the air. I can hear someone yelling. And it's like, I truly don't know what dude means by this.
It,
But
yeah.
it's also so visceral, and
I
it conveys the emotion of it so confrontationally. So it's either, it seems to vacillate between, with exceptions, obviously, vacillate between these really blunt, you know, I've been feeling like I can't come up for the last 10 years, and, you know, talking about kissing yourself in the rain or whatever. And it's like, so there is both of these things, and both of them are true at the same time, and they don't negate each other, despite how literal one is. And it's really fascinating because that in itself sort of makes an interesting comparison between the parts of your brain that understand emotions in a very logical, familiar sense, especially when you've been living with them for a long time, and the parts of your brain that experience those emotions in the completely confrontational way
Yeah,
that so much of the album sort of sounds like.
sometimes you have to like make something abstract in order to be able to deal with it. You have to kind of, have some kind of artistic license, or you have to kind of conceptualize something in a different way. This is sort of neither here nor there, but I like how both this album and the MJ Lenderman album have moments where the, existential horror of feeling totally isolated in the world is captured by dissociating underneath a McDonald's sign.
I knew
Eh,
I knew we were both headed in the same
I
direction
was
when
I
you
was
started
I
talking
was
about that.
sitting in the line at McDonald's last night
Bro.
after seeing The
Like,
Substance, which I highly recommend if you
yeah,
like horrible things. Not horrible films. It's a great film, but it's
Nasty.
disgusting. I was sitting under the McDonald's sign in the drive-through, and I was like, "Is this the Kentucky McDonald's?
yeah.
I,
Is this
The
the
Morgan,
one?"
Morgan, hands to God, this happened to me last night when I went into the break room at my workplace and I walked up to the window that's right in front of the trash cans in the break room and I look outside and what is there on the horizon directly to my left across the road on Nicholasville Road? But the McDonald's, the
McDonald's.
arches fully ablaze with the neon light of the night. And there I was, sitting there listening to Kentucky McDonald's, having a fucking moment beneath beneath the glow of the arches themselves. Thank you, MJ Lenderman. Though
Yeah.
I have to say, I really, first of all, I both of you just put so much of what makes this album special so beautifully that I couldn't possibly attempt to piggyback off the top of it, but yet here I am. Um, it's kind of like Morgan, you said something that is like it's bleak, but that's the thing, is that it's like it's the way we compartmentalize things. It's like what Riley said. It's that like it is bleak, but we are forced to compartmentalize our lives in a way where we have to laser focus on the things that aren't wholly bleak, which is art. But then when you start making art, the art becomes about how you can't make art because everything is hard. And that's what happens when you're a band like Foxing, is that you get in this big tumble dryer of artistic intent and your fans' expectations and all this frustrating bullshit. And this album to me is them, like, ironically, cutting through the noise. It's just being like, it's them being Moses parting the Red Sea of bullshit and walking through the center of it and being like, fuck me, ain't that some shit? And there is something to it of just like examining it in a space where you are comfortable, in a place where dissection and interrogation is not rendered to be a further complication, just another thing in the list of things that you already have to deal with. And that's so beautifully illustrated on a song like Barking, which comes right before the euphoria of Kentucky McDonald's, which is not a sentence I ever thought I would say. But I have had
I
many a moment
almost
at a Kentucky McDonald's with Morgan. So, I mean,
I
who am
I
I to
almost
judge?
full on did the SpongeBob. You what? When I saw the track list, I was
I
like,
mean, like it
why
feels
are you in my
targeted.
house?
Like, Connor, what were you doing here? Also, let me buy you a drink, bro. But like, man, I can't to reincorporate something I brought up earlier when I was talking about how I felt while being slightly incapacitated with Nilufer Yanya. There's a lot of similar feelings being mined out of this album, but there's that line he has where he says, I stared too long at at my pile of clothes till they looked like cicada shells," which first of all is like one of my favorite similes I've heard in recent memory, just because I don't know how he managed to perfectly distill how the curvature of your clothes look after they've been sitting in a place for a while with cicada shells, but he did it perfectly. But
And
then
it's
there's
also
just
like
like Bart.
it's how these like I don't know, sort of like functional things in your life can turn into mountains of horror and unpleasantness when you're not functioning the way
Well,
when you fuck reset
yeah, you're
when you're
right.
not functioning the way that you normally do or should be.
Mm,
And that's why the cicada shell lyric is so great, because it's also like clothes are the shell of your former better or just like more active self. So again, it's a great comparison. But like Barking, like you said that you were talking about those lines and how they were evocative, and I completely agree. But honestly, the meaning I get out of that like chorus refrain, the kissing yourself to prime for the rain, is simple. It's just it's you, because your anxiety has programmed you to anticipate these things before they happen. You self-soothe when you see a wave of anxiety coming.
mm,
You do things
mm.
that will comfort you before the onset comes. And you get to a point where you don't even know if what's coming at you is even a wave of anxiety. You're just anticipating it coming. So you prepare because you don't want to be caught unprepared, because you know what that fucking feels like. And that shit can put you in the fucking hospital.
Yeah.
It sucks.
My favorite sequence in this album. I mean, first of all, I think the first four songs as a run of music is just one of the most impressive things that Foxing have ever done, but that's neither here nor there. The sequence that really cemented this album for me is Looks Like Nothing into Gratitude. These two songs back to back. Like
Yeah.
the moments you're describing, like this was the point in the record where I've the most consistently had that feeling. Um, the way that this Looks Like Nothing just sort of builds so slowly into this like utterly unreal release of energy about 3 minutes into the song.
Mm-hmm.
When it's so much about willingly embracing your like how you've lived with this fantasy of success for so long. Like you've had this aspiration of reaching a certain point, and you realize that, well, that you will never be content with that. Even if you reach that point, it will never feel like enough. You will have reevaluated that idea of what that success was and made it more unattainable. But also just like how hollow it would feel if you even got to that point. How what you're really looking for is more than just that sense of like, being loved and adored or whatever. Um, the way the song explodes around that feeling and around that screamed sentiment of thank you, you're too kind, is just unbelievable to me. But then it goes into Gratitude, which is my absolute favorite song on the album. Uh,
Oh.
this is like one of those things as well where I remember what it felt like to hear this song for the first time, and I'll remember that experience was for a very long time. It absolutely, like the refrain of the song, give me snapping of the brain. My brain snapped all right while I was listening to this. I felt like I was going to have an aneurysm. I felt like there was a blood vessel popping in my brain as I was listening to this. It like, and I'd already gone through the album up to this point. I had that like, you know, brutal awakening of those first two songs. I'd gotten to this point. I was not expecting the album to find a higher level of intensity than it already had with Hell 99, and yet it does this with
Yep.
Gratitude. Um, it's interesting to know as I read a profile of the band on Stereogum while they were of the period of making this album. They talked about, how hard it was to make this album, how much the band almost fell apart while they were making it, how, and this is interesting as well, how utterly miserable the experience of making this album was for them. It's the feelings the album evokes and the things it talks about are even more interesting when you find out just how much they hated making the album. It wasn't even like a pleasant cathartic experience. It was grinding. And of course, so much of the work to, create or to kind of reach your kind of point of contentment or of achievement in your life is like that. It is a grinding, mill of work. But there was an interesting detail that Eric Hudson, the guitarist and producer, hated this song so much. Like he just did not want it to be on the album, did not want to have to think about mixing it or doing anything with it because it just drove him insane. And like here I was sitting here having this revelatory experience listening to this song, being like, this is one of the most amazing songs this band have ever made. Um,
Uh-huh.
and I don't really have a wider point with that. I just found that bit of contrast that I was experiencing listening to it really, really funny. This was the baptism by fire, basically, that Hell 99 as a second single promised, and that the album itself delivers as a holistic statement, but this song in particular like zeroes in on in a way that's so confronting. It almost breaks the album at that point. And the next couple of songs are some of the most strange and unformed songs before the album kind of hits its stride again in its home stretch. Uh, yeah, it's such an impactful moment, this song. I just had to shout it out.
Yeah, I think also it's Murphy's peak as a vocalist on this album, and
Oh yeah.
which means that it's the peak of like a slew of Mount Rushmore moments for this already extremely proven and talented vocalist who
Mm.
has such an unbelievable range, not even like in terms of the scale musically, but like of emotions that can be convincingly conveyed.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. And some of the last iterations of the chorus in this song, there's just a tonality in the way he sings that's like scary.
Yeah.
Hmm.
It's why I think putting Dead Cat after Gratitude immediately and that being like such a what the hell is this moment on the album is so like ingenious structurally because it's like, oh, dude's just gone now.
Yeah.
After that moment on the album, bro
Dude,
is cooked.
the lyrics on Dead Cat, like I initially was just kind of like, oh, this is, more interstitial. I didn't really give this the attention it deserved on first listen, but like this has some of my favorite lyrics on the whole album. The fucking feels like I missed the real end. I must live in the index. The universe is mumbling, buy a gun or something. Like, Jesus Christ, man.
And it just sounds so completely burnt out in itself of like this has, you know, it feels like a band who has suddenly become 90 years old out of nowhere and is struggling to get through an upbeat classic of theirs. And it just sounds like boop, doop, 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 doop. Like it just sounds fucked.
And yet the album still is able to pull back from that break and end in a, if not an upbeat, happy place, then at least a more reflective place with Hall of Frozen Heads, which is, a beautiful song,
Kind
like completely
kind
unlike
of a
anything else on the
sequel
album.
song to Gratitude because of the some of the lyrical arrange that, I mean, it
Yeah,
starts off with I've been living like a memory, and
yeah.
also later there's another one that I can't remember that also references gratitude, but it does feel like there's a mini arc that happens between these two songs on the album.
No, it's like a necessary calm down song. Like the album, if anything, almost pushes too hard and goes too far before it gets to this point. Like it's like such a relief to get a song like this that, you know, lets you sit in the space for a while as well. It's one of the longer songs on the album, and I'm really grateful that it is too. It suits that function beautifully. And then the album ends with Crybaby, which is sort of a love song from Connor to his partner, basically. And so one theme I do want to kind of mention in passing as well is that animals and pets are a thing that that come up on a lot of Foxing albums. Actually, they're a frequent motif. Obviously, like the idea of companionship, the idea of connection. There's an almost dispiriting number of Foxing songs that I read as being about losing a pet as well, which just sort of makes
Yeah.
it all the more hard hitting. To me, this was what my interpretation of the song "Cleaning" was about. Was specifically about losing a pet and sort of being so devastated by that that you sort of like the opening line, "I'm sorry I left you to soak in it for days," um, to his partner, basically, essentially, when he kind of, in this scenario I'm imagining completely, was so stricken by his grief that he didn't effectively communicate. And then the line, "I swear I heard his nails clicking on the kitchen tile," is so specifically evocative
Mm.
of that to me as well. And then the ending where it's like, "Don't clean the floor just yet, keep him in the wood grain."
Ugh.
If you have lost a pet, and most people, have to experience this at some point, yeah, you are like, you dread the moment where you stop being able to smell them specifically. And this song really hit home because it reminded me of that feeling, and brought that up, which was exactly what I needed to experience when I was like 20 minutes into an album that starts the way it does.
No,
The
fucking
song, that song in particular, "Cleaning," I feel like is really easy to overlook because it's so musically sparse. But there's that to me is like the one of the most emotionally pointed moments on the album. Uh, like in terms of being about a specific experience that I relate to, that I cannot like overlook that song. It really hit home for me, listening to this album. Yeah, yeah, you know.
I lost my pet this year, and I think about however when I go to my mom's house before, my dog used to shed a lot, and when we would come back, everything we owned would be covered in white hair. It was
Mm,
fucking annoying as shit. I had to like there was a time where I would have a brush just to solely brush myself off when I would come home from things. And then I would fucking and now I'm just like I miss that little inconvenience. And I that that's what that is. It's how you take things for you take these little tiny things for granted. And then when you reevaluate them, they mean something. And I feel like that's what the end of this is that it's just like, hey, take a moment. I think this album to me is not just about catharsis, but it's about making structure out of catharsis, because that's the most difficult. Like catharsis is easy. Like I can go outside and scream at the top of my lungs and feel great about it and walk back inside and be like, whew, needed to get that out. But like, how do you turn that scream into something real? How do you make it into something that feels worth making? And
mm,
that's fucking hard, man. And this album is about how fucking hard it is. And the fact that the band almost tore themselves up over this, I mean, there's no better indictment of the world that we live in that all of this is so fucking difficult for everybody.
mm. Something I just remembered as well. I missed this the first time I listened to the album, but the second time I caught it, at the end of Hall of Frozen Heads, there's this moment you can barely hear it, where Connor finishes singing the song, and his dog must be there in the studio with him, because you just hear him go very quietly, "That's a good boy," and like
Yes, yes.
legitimately having missed that the first time I heard the album, and then going through it again with like this feeling of what the song "Cleaning" was about already set in my head, and knowing that Connor's written about pet grief before, picking up on that, I just like I was just like Fuck
No, it's
off.
vicious,
You
man.
can't do this to me, man. You can't do this. But it was like, but it's, yeah, it's beautiful because, it's a moment of companionship. Uh, like after so much music about isolation. And even though like I said Cry Baby, the closing track is a love song to his partner, and it is, but it's also a song about like making a choice to be better for someone else. And it's maybe like I lock it up is the thing he says in the song, right? Like he hides some of the true shit he's going through. And that's, sometimes not very healthy to do. And you should be able to like open up and be your real authentic self with your partner or whatever. But like
But
there is also always some degree of self-direction that you have in relationships, and it's ignorant to ignore it, or it's not ignorant, but it's like it's misguided to pretend it's not a real thing. And of course the Nilufer Yanya album talks about this as well. There's always some degree of performance in every avenue of your life. And in shutting down and locking up this dark part of himself so that he can enjoy being around this person and coming home to them, that's a kind of a necessary part of the routine of how he copes and how he manages. It doesn't mean he's not dealing with his, you know, pain in other ways, but it is also just a part of life, is sometimes you do have to compartmentalize. But even learning to compartmentalize is a step forward from being, completely unbounded and unhinged and, at the mercy of your broken brain. So there's progress there. There's also a hint of things maybe not being fully dealt with or processed yet, but that's the way it is. It's not, you don't just overcome everything and then you're fine. You have to take a step forward towards that. And I like the way that that closing song sort of acknowledges that complexity. Um, and that's the thing I don't think I actually really appreciated about that song until after quite a few listens. So, the album is still growing on me.
so in that respect, I guess this being a self-titled album, to wrap a bow on it, is kind of apt because yeah, Foxing have never quite made an album that sounds like this, sure, but what better way to name a statement like this than with something that illustrates that you have always been willing to change drastically and you will continue to do so.
Yeah, I mean, there's that line in Crybaby. If I could, I'd start over again. It's been fun, but I would change everything. Like that almost
That's
made me laugh the first time I heard it because
dude,
it's such a
that
an
that to
admission,
me is
right?
the most powerful line on this album that basically only constitutes really powerful lines because to me being an adult the most difficult emotion you have to grapple with as an adult for me is acknowledging that you wholeheartedly 100% regret things that you have done or that have happened, and that you can acknowledge that I should have done that differently, and then things would be different, and then my life would be better. Like that those things exist. I could have done things, I could have changed, but I didn't. And now I'm me, and I have to live with the fact that an alternate version of myself in some reality is probably a lot happier than I am because it's not healthy, but it is something you have to think about a lot.
Hmm.
And it sucks. But it doesn't
Damn,
have to suck. And that's the important thing.
damn. We really going through it.
The
Fucking
thesis statement of the album, the horrors persist, but so do I. This is my favorite album of the year. It is we don't really do ratings anymore, but this is my first 10 of the year, probably my last. But you know, it's good to finally have the moment of 2024 for me.
Let us know what you think at home of either of the albums we've discussed today. Foxing's Foxing and Nilufer Yanya's My Method Actor. Let us know also your favorite examples of self-titled albums that aren't debuts if we didn't mention them. Or even if we did, let us know what your favorite album is, self-titled album is that isn't a debut in the comments below. We'll be back again soon next week, whenever we're back to talk about more new music. So stick around and we'll see you there. Rock over London, rock on Chicago, McDonald's. I'm loving it.